Tonight, we won't chase legends of treasure maps or forgotten prophecies. Instead, we will linger with 5 short words scratched into a wall quiet words that somehow refuse to vanish even when the city around them turned to ash. Sator arepo tenet opera rotas. The letters arrange themselves into a perfect square, reading forward and backward, up and down, as if they've been practicing balance for centuries. Not loud, not dramatic, just endlessly patient. In Pompeii, when the sky collapsed and stone hardened into silence, this little grid remained, like a breath caught mid-sentence. The same fire that turned figs into charcoal and bread into archaeology pressed these lines of Latin so firmly into plaster, but they still breathe across 2,000 years. Archaeologists copied them into notebooks, then into catalogs, and at last into quiet rooms where the words are read aloud like a riddle no one is obliged to solve. A sewer named Aripo, wheels that turn, work, effort, motion. Or perhaps nothing at all, just the comfort of letters refusing to forget themselves. So lower the lights. Let your breathing follow the slow rhythm of words that never hurry. If quiet journeys like this steady your night, you're welcome to stay. If they carry you towards sleep, then the square will keep watch for you. And should you feel like joining again, perhaps share where and when you're listening from. The next story might be waiting by your side. And if this quiet keeps you company for a while, stay as long as you like. The story will keep unfolding, whether your eyes stay open or drift closed before the last page turns. Because once we step beyond the doorway of that little square, the trail does not vanish. It winds through ash plaster parchment and whispers, carrying its 5 words from room walls to crowded seminar rooms, from a city buried in silence to hands that still trace its letters today. The riddle doesn't shout, it lingers like a lamp left glowing in the corner of a room, waiting to show us where to go next. The square begins the way many resilient things begin, an ash on plaster half noticed, as though the sentence was mid-breath when the breath paused. In Pompeii, a smudged grid of letters survived the same falling sky that pressed figs into coins and turned lunch into archaeology. The letters held their shape like a well-folded napkin. Archaeologists copied the square into notebooks, then into catalogs, and then into the kind of seminar where everyone nods at the Latin and someone murmurs, just loud enough to be heard above the hum of the slide projector. That tenet in the middle makes a pleasing little cross. The room approves politely. The phrase looks as if it should mean something obvious. Sator, the sower. Arepo, a name or not a name. Tenet, he holds. Opera, works. Rotas, wheels. A sower named Arepo holds the wheels with care. Or perhaps a plowman clings to effort as his cart turns. Or perhaps this is not about a plow at all, and we are forcing a poor field into an office job it did not request. Nothing in the scene explains why it was written. The silence wears the meaning like a scarf. The charm, if that is what it is, does not raise its voice. It is the quiet kind of riddle that prefers to be remembered, the way you remember which cupboard has the good mugs, not by a rule, but by repetition. The square travels easily because it packs lightly. 5 words fit on tiles, classroom slates, the back page of a missile, the underside of a drawer where a carpenter left a joke for the next century's carpenter to find. It shows up in Rome, Britain, in Gaul, in the Alps, with a stamp of familiarity, like a sticker that says, "This was here before you." Sometimes the letters are a little crooked, the way memory leans when no one is watching, but the order returns like a garden looped by the same narrow path. What begins in ash continues in ink, and what begins in a ruined city is very good at living in unruined ones. People carry the square the way people carry a tune they do not know the words to, softly, persistently, mostly on key. Letters travel faster than carts and do not ask for oats. They settle in monasteries where a scribe illuminates a margin with vines that look like thoughts taking a stroll. They appear in a stable where a farmer scratched the grid on a door as if to hold the day in place. They ride along in a pocket as a charm against an unpleasant lawsuit, which is, historically speaking, a popular use for compact Latin. The square never explains why it helps. It just squares itself and waits. Because it looks like a code, we keep trying keys on it. People roll the words around like little wheels and immediately suspect there must be a secret axle hiding inside. Someone notices that if you rearrange the letters, you can spell Paternoster in a tidy cross. And in the leftovers, 2 A's and 2 O's see the alpha and the omega, Greek letters with very confident first and last energy. This feels like a solution. It feels like the moment a jigsaw's lost piece turns up under the cat. The square beams benignly. To some, it is a Christian sign pressed quietly into the world when symbols were shy. To others, it is an accident of Latin behaving nicely, because Latin often behaves nicely when stacked in symmetrical piles. The middle word, tenet, makes a little plus sign whichever direction you cut through it. This is the kind of detail that makes a scholar smile, the way a carpenter smiles when 2 boards line up without complaint. If the square wanted attention, it chose the right trick. Rotations and reflections make the grid behave like a slow kaleidoscope where nothing changes except your patience. Mathematicians note that the symmetry group is satisfying. Skeptics note that satisfaction is not the same as history. Meanwhile, the letters fill in planets and salts and scribbles and alchemical treatises as though they are ingredients you could stir. A Renaissance reader says the charm protects barn doors. A Bavarian grandmother says it cures a fever when drawn on toast. Somewhere a school child with a neat hand copies it because the teacher says palindromes are good for posture. The square, like a coin, has 2 sides: solemn utility and everyday comfort. Medieval recipe books tuck it between counsel to ward off a headache and counsel to keep butter from misbehaving in hot weather. You write the square on a small piece of parchment and tape it to a sore, knee well, not tape. The medieval world had many things and also did not, but you attach it with conviction. If the knee does not improve, the parchment is quiet about whose fault that was. Judges have been known to encounter the square in awkward places, like the inside of a defendant's sleeve just before testimony. It does not sway the court. It does soothe the cuff. Farmers, who tend to want tools to be tools, occasionally recite the sentence slowly in a field, as if speaking Latin into furrows will keep the furrows calm in a storm. The line about a repo the plowman is so tidy that it might have been invented simply because a sower deserves a proper name, the way a ship does. A repo could be no one and everyone at once, a kind of polite placeholder, the John Doe of agriculture. A modern translator with a fondness for clarity will sometimes render the square as a single rustic sentence. The sower Arapo keeps the wheels at work. It reads like something you would find on a mug near a very patient tractor. But the grammar crinkles if you stare at it too long. Arepo is not a word we see elsewhere, unless we decide it is now. Opera is effort, but also works of. Rhodos are wheels, but also the wheels. The sentence behaves like a polite stranger who answers every question with a nod. Perhaps this is the charm, vagueness that behaves like certainty. Courts and kitchens have long admired words that feel useful. The square obliges by being small enough to write on a door lintel, on a hearthstone, on a button. In a plague year, someone chalks it onto a gatepost and finds that the chalk stays longer than the fear, which is not the same as causation, but in the dark the two can get acquainted. A cautious doctor in a careful town writes it in the margin of a casebook next to a recipe involving vinegar, rosemary, and prayer. The square does not age. A handwriting does. Some people hide the grid inside their hats, which is not glamorous but does keep the letters warm. I have seen it tucked into the back of a drawer as if a carpenter left a lodger a note. In this house, the wheels keep working. When folks say that the charm works, they usually mean that the day went on, which is the most common kind of miracle. In museums, the square lives under glass where it naps securely. We bring to it clipboards and questions, both of which travel well. Epigraphers take squeezes, which are like paper hugs, and compare letter forms the way cousins compare childhood heights on a doorframe. Is the R of Pompeii more upright than the R of Cirencester? Did a soldier carry the sentence with him? Or did the sentence travel by itself, like a plant whose seeds ride on cloaks? We line up examples and whisper hesitant if. If the square is older than Christians thought, then perhaps the cross inside it is a coincidence. If the square is as late as some believe, perhaps it was a gentle password in an unwelcoming time. If Arepo is just a made-up name, it is a capable one. If it is not a name at all, it is a very convincing guest. We stack the ifs on a tray and try not to spill them. The lab light is bright. The stones are quiet. They refuse to confirm or deny. They are very professional. Stratigraphy adds its careful stripes, and the plaster's grain shows a little in the photographs, like a fingerprint that will not talk. The square never once admits to being a spell, and yet fields of marginal notes behave as if the grid were a modestly dressed talisman who never eats the last biscuit. We test translations as if they were spare keys. Sometimes they open a sensible door. Sometimes they open a broom closet. The sower Arepo guides the wheels carefully. Arepo, the farmer, holds works with wheels. The maker, in his efforts, keeps the circles turning. Meanwhile, the pattern, the neat mirror of letters, does its respectful gymnastics. You can read the square in spirals, which feels unnecessary, and in diagonals, which feels athletic, and in a knight's move, which feels like a board game that would take all afternoon and at least one sandwich. Mathematicians count the symmetries and smile into their tea. A classicist points out that a palindrome this tidy in Latin is either the work of a clever person or a congregation of coincidences enjoying a picnic. The truth nods from a far hill and declines to walk down. We propose that the square went viral the way folk cures go viral, not with panic, but with affection. It is a friendly ritual. It keeps your place on the page. It fits on a beam over the stable door. It asks nothing extravagant. And if it brought comfort in a quiet way, who would argue with that? Sometimes at night, I like to imagine the inscription without its fame, just as 5 gentle words strung in an unhurried row by someone whose hand had ash on it. Perhaps it was an apprentice testing his letters under the supervision of a master who had an eye for balance. Perhaps it was a woman who liked grids, or bored watchmen, or a child trying to make a neat trick repeat. People have always liked puzzles that do not bite. The Sator square is a puzzle that behaves itself in public. It knows how to sit through long meetings. It knows how to wait out centuries in dark rooms. When packed away, it folds along its lines without creasing. We keep inventing reasons for it because we are a meaning species, and also because bedtime likes a riddle with rounded corners. If it carried a hidden key to eternity, eternity has not filed a complaint. If it was a joke, it was a durable one. When in doubt, the grid slides into the pocket of habit, and habit is a very persuasive tailor. Back at the beginning, or what we treat as the beginning, ashes hold a street still, and a wall whispers a square that will not die. Dust remembers better than we do. Dust holds a letter like a small hand. A day freezes, and the letters do not shiver. Centuries unfreeze, and the letters stroll off to find new doors. Somewhere a teacher draws the grid on the chalkboard, and a student draws it in the notebook, and later on the inside of a guitar case, which makes no sense to anyone else, but keeps the wheels at a good home. You can see how a modest square, copied long enough, becomes less of a message and more of a method. When life leans, the grid is something to lean against. The sower sows, or doesn't. The wheels turn, or do not. The grammar is patient either way. If we were to decide that the square is simply a pleasing arrangement of letters with a whiff of agriculture and a hobby of geometry, we would not be wrong. If we were to decide that it has sheltered people from fear because it sits so neatly it looks like protection, we would not be wrong either. Words are capable of both. They hold shape the way a good bowl holds soup, not by magic, but by craft. The Sator square is a vessel for attention, and attention is strangely sturdy. Imagine a doorway in a storm. Someone chalks a small grid on the lintel because their grandmother did. The rain passes. The chalk fades. The memory does not. A historian dutifully notes that correlation is not causation. The grandmother nods and makes tea. Somewhere a monk turns the grid into an acrostic prayer without telling anyone, because secrecy and sincerity are old roommates. Somewhere else, a mason leaves the square behind a stone, and the stone keeps the secret for 500 years because stones love their work, and so the 5 words continue. They behave themselves in manuscripts and on refrigerator magnets. They allow translations to compete politely. They accept being called a charm when the day is difficult and a curiosity when it is not. They forgive the archaeologist their footnotes and the internet its enthusiasm. What other inscription can be drafted into such varied service while remaining so steadfastly bland? The square has no scandal. It never argues in public. It passes the centuries like a commuter who always finds the same seat. We would not notice it if it weren't durable. We would not be moved by it if it weren't quiet. It is the kind of history that is more like weather than like war. Present, gentle, cumulative, and very hard to summarize excitingly at parties. Tonight, if you like, you can trace the letters in the air with a fingertip the way you might trace the edge of a mug. Sator arepo tenet opera rotas. There's a rhythm to it that suits a slow breath. You can imagine the grid as a little field in which nothing very dramatic happens. A plow might pass, a cart might creak. The wheels will keep their small promise. The work will hold. If you drift off in the middle, the sentence won't mind. It has been waiting for 2 millennia in ash and ink and door frames. It is very good at waiting. And when you return to it, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps later, it will still read itself in every direction, steady as a square set gently on a table, turning no faster than a heartbeat, turning as long as someone quietly lets it. You might not expect a checkered tablecloth to run a kingdom's finances, but it did in a patient, square-by-square way that would make any kitchen proud. The exchequer, before it became a word that sounds like a marble statue clearing its throat, was first a literal table with a cloth on it dark and light squares like a board game, or like a picnic blanket that learned arithmetic. If you were still awake by the time I reached the part about tally sticks being split lengthwise like a particularly stubborn breadstick, you can subscribe. Or don't, I'll still be here, counting counters slowly, moving them from square to square at a speed designed for breathing and bedtime. Imagine a hall that smells faintly of beeswax and parchment, and a cloth laid smooth over thick planks. A clerk stands at one side, a treasurer on another, and between them sits a box of round tokens that look like biscuits but spin like information. The table doesn't do math. It just stays very still while numbers are persuaded to happen on top of it. This is government at its homiest, not a tower or a triumph, but furniture. On that cloth, each square meant a size of number in the old honest way. One's here, 10's there, 100's further along, like a polite family at supper who have assigned seats and never change them. Counters slid into place, and the cloth accepted them with the kind of quiet that comes from cotton minding its business. The exchequer's earliest clerks liked to compare their work to chess, though the pieces behave less dramatically. Nobody becomes a queen. Nobody takes a knight. Occasional arguments happen at a pace one could embroider to. A sheriff arrives from some county you can picture as a rounded shape on a map and empties a bag of coins with the resigned look of someone unloading a week's groceries. The money is counted, weighed, sometimes tasted, because medieval coins enjoy being suspicious. The counters on the cloth take over the work of remembering. A stack here means the king is owed this much for the farm of the shire. A neat diagonal there means, yes, but subtract the custody of a bridge, which was expensive, as bridges are. The cloth never rolls its eyes. If anyone invented spreadsheets in wool, it was these people, and they iron nothing. The room is louder than you'd expect. There's the clink of coin and the soft click of counters that have been touched so often they shine like old buttons. There's the murmur of Latin and phrases designed for staying awake. Item, idem, idem, cheerful little adverbs meaning also the same in the same year, like lullabies for bookkeepers. Someone sharpens a quill slowly, the way you peel an apple with the intention of not dropping the peel. A clerk reads aloud from a roll that is genuinely a roll, parchment sewn in links, wound like a carpet, storing the year's accounts in a scroll the size of a sleepy corgi. They call these the pipe rolls. No one knows why with certainty. Perhaps because the rolled-up account looks exactly like the bagpipe a clerk's cousin plays on feast days. Perhaps because the Latin word like the sound of itself. The important thing is that the roll keeps rolling, and the cloth keeps being steady, and the numbers, such as they are, settle into their seats for winter. If a sheriff is late, the cloth waits. If he is early, which is ambitious, the cloth smiles with squares. A micro detail, at this stage, that never fails to amuse the patient. A weight of coin called a mark is not an actual coin at all. It is a number 2/3 of a pound used so often that it begins to believe itself real. Imagine paying your rent with an imaginary 20 that both sides agree to imagine. The exchequer is filled with such courteous illusions, counters pretending to be money, sums pretending to be stones and roads, sheriffs pretending not to be nervous. One rule remains serious: the tally sticks. They are links of willow, notched for numbers the way a child might notch a walking stick for miles traveled. The stick is split down its length into a stalk and a foil, each half carrying the same notches. The exchequer keeps one half, the sheriff keeps the other. They fit only one way, like two pieces of a small wooden secret. This is the medieval version of two-factor authentication, and it is surprisingly adorable. Tally sticks lean in baskets, their notches like a tiny saw's teeth. Each notch means something particular: pennies, shillings, pounds, its depth and spacing agreed upon with the seriousness of bakers discussing crust. The most welcome thing about the tallies, to a mind easing into sleep, is how they smell: a faint river scent from the willow, a ghost of smoke if they've dried by a hearth. They are as portable as silence. A sheriff tucks one into a pouch and it becomes the county's dead walking around on two legs. Later, when he returns, the halves marry with a neat click. If they refuse to match, there will be a conversation conducted at the speed of embarrassment. But the wood seldom lies. If the exchequer could have carried pockets, it would have been full of little sticks humming with arithmetic. Because a table is useful, it slowly becomes a place. The exchequer settles into Westminster like a cat claiming a sunlit chair. What began as cloth over planks now has a ceremonial tone. Black rods, green cloth, a silver tally knife with an edge too dignified for anything but willow. You can tell the institution is thriving because it's traditionless, grove-specific. A junior clerk must stand here, a senior clerk there, and the king, when he visits, sits where the light falls kindly but not blindingly, as if someone has tested the angle in each season, which someone surely has. Accounts are sworn on a gospel, which is to say a book that weighs enough to make a statement, not so much as to strain the wrist. A counter scuttles 2 squares to the left, making the sound a draft makes under a door. If you listen long enough, each exchequer session describes a year without telling a story. Floods because fewer mills paid. Repairs because bridges rarely behave. Scutage a fee standing politely in for military service because the king has a trip in mind. Budgets, you learn, are a little like weather. They do not ask permission. Eventually, the exchequer acquires nicknames and habits. The upper exchequer audits like an ant who cannot help herself. The lower exchequer takes in cash, though both share the same cloth ancestry. Auditors ask questions in a tone that means no harm and no mercy. Why did the castle's roof cost more this year? The garrison, it turns out, preferred staying dry and lid is stubbornly heavy. Why is the fee for brewing mismeasured in Wit Week? Fermentation refuses to keep a calendar. The questions are gentle and relentless, which is a combination you either find soothing or terrifying. Somewhere in the margins, a clerk draws a fish because the pen wandered. Medieval margins do that. They are unofficial union breaks for pens. All the while, the square cloth holds a thought no one thinks to say aloud, that numbers are easier to believe when you can touch where they sit. Modern ledgers hide numbers in busy lines. The exchequer shows them taking up physical places the way people occupy chairs. If you want 10 more shillings, you move 10 white counters 1 square along. If you want them back, you move them back. The cloth is a green pasture for arithmetic that prefers grazing to galloping. This is why you can nearly fall asleep to it. The movement is simple, repetitive, and reversible. Someone always says, item, in a satisfying rhythm. A clerk clears his throat in B flat. The room exhales. People tend to think an institution is serious only when it is made of stone, but the exchequer proves otherwise. It is serious because it is a habit. It survives kings and tempers. It keeps its list of sheriffs like a town keeps a list of the children who have outgrown the schoolyard fence. A county's name recurs like a friendly refrain: Norfolk, Oxford. York, and next to it, numbers slide around as if dancing a slow, dignified pavan. If the sheriffs cheat, which some attempt with the confidence of people who believe their cleverness is new, the cloth does not mind. It has seen that dance before. Counters can be moved again. Tallies do not forgive mismatched notches. Occasionally, penalties are noted in Latin that sighs a little as it writes itself. Misericordia, mercy, often meaning a fine. Mercy, in this context, is a number that knows it could have been larger. The micro hook of the day while you doze somewhere near the window. The exchequer, as ink was so thick with carbon that when the pipe rolls are unrolled now, centuries later, the writing is still dark like last night's sky. Parchment crackles, a sound with precisely the volume of dry leaves being considerate. Names come up as if they never left. Walleran, Agnes, Ranulph everywhere. The sums are in Roman numerals, which climb and recede in solemn little battalions. X, 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 XLC. An exchequer clerk could count to great heights without ever using a digit as we know it. The cloth never complained about the lack of zero. It simply left the square for nothing unoccupied. The genius of nothing is vacancy. Long before desk calculators and send as PDF, the exchequer perfected a technique modern offices still admire: staging. A transaction did not happen until you could see it arranged sensibly. The sheriff spoke. The clerk repeated. The treasurer nodded. The counters paused in their squares like well-trained dogs. Then did the roll accept ink. Each step was so slightly dramatic that no one noticed the drama. It was like making tea. Boil water, warm the pot, spin the leaves, wait, pour. The steps matter to the result. They also create a calm that has very little to do with boiling or money and everything to do with pacing. The exchequer invented the meeting that cures insomnia, and I mean that as praise. Over time, tally sticks outlived their century by refusing to be inconvenient. They were hard to fake, obvious to check, and robust enough to survive pockets, damp, and grandchildren. At the very end of their career, this is a fact with a soft punchline: ancient tallies cleared out from storage were used as kindling in 1834 to feed the House of Lords stove, and instead fed a very dignified fire that burned down much of the Palace of Westminster. The medieval audit system, in its last official act, warmed the room too faithfully. The flames were not consulted about historical irony. If you doze off thinking of two willow halves neatly kissing in a check, you may wake to find them crackling into architecture at scale. The Exchequer would have put that in the extraordinary expenses column with a face that declined to comment. Modern people who speak of the Treasury seldom imagine a cloth. They picture an office block with bright lights and spreadsheets that feel like blizzards. And yet, when a budget statement is laid before a committee and everyone asks their ritual questions in a ritual order, the old square shows through like an underpainting. We still like our numbers to have agreed seats. We still prefer to move them in view. A spreadsheet's cells are just squares that forgot they were wool. Counters became digits. Tallies became signatures. The rhythm remains. Item, item, item. Also the same in the same year. You don't banish furniture that useful, you translate it. Let's lean for a moment into one sheriff's day for the sleepy pleasure of detail. He leaves his county at a sensible pace because speed rarely improves arithmetic. He carries coins, a pouch with a tally, and the knowledge that his predecessor tried to claim an allowance for repairing a bridge that did not exist until 3 years later. He plans to avoid that footnote. On arrival, he is greeted with the standard civility of officials meeting other officials. Everyone hopes everyone else's math is not today's problem. The treasurer's knife splits a new stick with a sound exactly like a small piece of history being made. Notches are added, one for £1, another for £1, a third carefully for pennies, and the two pieces are separated like twins sent to opposite sides of a room until they learn their lesson. Counters form their gentle formation. The roll unfurls another foot. The sheriff breathes. The clerk writes quietus at the end of a line, meaning he can go home for now. Quietus, as a word, behaves like a door that has learned to close without slamming. If you listen under the numbers, you hear the kingdom. A line of accounts sighs about the sea flooding low fields. A fine for brewing without a license remembers a week of cheerful disorder. The fee for wardship guarding a minor's inheritance reminds everyone that people do not time themselves conveniently. The Exchequer brings the far counties into one room, just long enough to make their lives look sortable. It is a flatterer and a realist. It reduces to fit the cloth. It admits more than it pretends to. A modern analogy floats up like a bubble from a very warm bath. This is a group chat for medieval infrastructure, but without emojis, unless you count the fish in the margins. Someone whispers that the cloth may have been green on purpose, soothing to the eye. It is a good color for a place where daylight matters and candles squint. Wax drips onto wood, not cloth, because the cloth is cared for. A boy is sent to fetch sand to dry the ink, and returns with the exact amount the senior clerk prefers. He learned the handful size last year and will never forget. A tiny absurdity unfolds. One of the counters has a small dent in it that resembles a bishop hat, and superstition insists it is lucky to use the bishop for bridge repairs. No one argues. Luck and accounting are distant cousins who nod politely at reunions. When you're very nearly asleep, it helps to know that the Exchequer had a calendar like a soft metronome. There were terms, Easter, Michaelmas, when sheriffs came due, and in between the hall returned to an ordinary quiet that probably included some unnoticed humming. A stack of unrolled rolls looked like a lazy bundle of firewood. A broom leaned against a post. A cat almost certainly investigated the counters and was shooed with a kind of dignified affection. Institutions that last accept cats as part of their budget. Somewhere a clerk kept a private list of how many times he had heard the phrase, with all customs and liberties. He may have invented a game where every time someone cites a liberty, he earns the right to go to the door and look at the sky for one count of 20. In the final drowsy stretch, consider what a triumph this all is for boredom. The Exchequer is not a story about heroes or collapse. It is a story about patient repetition wearing a groove and time deep enough to guide a state. From that cloth came years of pipe rolls that modern scholars still read when they want to know what normal felt like. How many mills ground grain in Dorset in 1172? The roll tells you, not proudly, just accurately. Who owed for a ferry? The cloth remembers where the counter sat. It is delightful to know that much stability can be made of a board, a pattern, and a refusal to be hurried. If you'd like, trace a little grid in your mind now. Place a token for today's small gains, 2 for the conversations that were pleasant, 1 for the email you did not write because you did not need to. Slide a token back for the thing you forgot. It can go home to its square and rest. Set aside a tally for tomorrow, with notches shallow enough to be gentle. Let the squares keep still. Numbers like to sit down when they're done. And if you drift in the middle of the next item, don't worry. The clerks will keep counting at a pace no faster than you're breathing. The tallies will hum softly in their baskets. And the cloth, that old careful furniture, will go on holding everyone's place until morning. You might not expect the size of a sheet of paper to have an origin story with arm spans, candle soot, and a mathematician who liked tidy ratios. But it does, and it tells itself very softly, edge to edge. If you were still awake by the time we reach the part where a piece called AO is defined by having an area of exactly 1 square meter comforting, like a blanket that read the manual, you can subscribe or let the thought drift away like a curl of paper out of a ream. In the beginning, there isn't a beginning so much as there is a tabletop and a scribble room and a vat for making pulp, which is to say there are hands. Sheets are scooped from slurry by a mold and a decal whose sizes are whatever the vatman's arms find reasonable that week. A clerk calls a sheet chancery because chancery uses it. A lawyer calls another foolscap, perhaps because someone doodled a gesture on a watermark. A printer says pot and crown, the way gardeners say standard and weeping, and accept that everyone knows. Nothing is strictly measured. Quarto means a sheet folded twice, octavo thrice, duodecimo more than that, until the book begins to feel like a deck of cards with opinions. Pages are born of folds. A book is a conversation between a sheet and a crease. Scribes leave generous margins because human hands are smudgy, and also because readers enjoy somewhere to put their quiet arguments. A curious person around the 17th century might ask why a sheet is so nearly 17 by 22 inches in one shop and nothing like it in another. The answer is partly that paper likes to shrink while drying, the way wool does when it remembers it used to be a sheep. It is also that mills calibrate to the reach of their workers. A vatman stretches his arms, the mold fits the span. If he retires and his nephew is shorter, the family of paper becomes slightly smaller. The way a town's accent can change when a single cafe changes owners. Somewhere, an apothecary writes a recipe on post size. Somewhere else, a parish clerk folds foolscap for minutes written in a hand that looks as though it has been taught to walk on stilts. Printers manage by imposition, which is not a command, but a layout. Pages placed in a pattern so that when the big sheet is folded and trimmed, the human eye finds chapter 1 in front of chapter 2 without complaint. The pattern is arithmetic that smells of ink. Compositors memorize it the way bakers memorize oven behavior. On winter afternoons, a compositor can look at a scattered form and tell you where a poem's last line will sit after the fold, which feels like witchcraft but is mostly patience. The micro-absurdity of the day is that a watermark, a tiny wire glued into the mold, decides prestige for centuries. Put a crown in the wire and the sheet becomes crown. Choose a pot and pot it remains. And pot it is traded by merchants who will never boil anything in it. The watermark is a whisper that becomes a family name. Meanwhile, the world enjoys not agreeing. France has its own spread of sizes. The German lands develop theirs. Britain cheerfully keeps many at once. And across the ocean, a new standard coalesces, not because a committee decreed it, but because paper molds were made 11 inches long, an agreeable length for the forearm of a mayonnaise vat, and the width drifted until 8.5 felt sensible. You know this Mao's letter? No myth will quite explain why the United States chose to stand there forever like someone who arrived early to a party and never moved from the hallway. Offices adapt. Filing cabinets learn to be slightly different on either side of the Atlantic, the way kettles learn to whistle in various accents. There's a pause in the 19th century where paper tries to listen to science. Engineers begin to imagine that if sizes had a proportional relationship, printers would waste less when trimming. The mind that enjoys graph paper enjoys this idea a great deal. It is a German physicist, Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, who plays idly with the thought that if you cut a rectangle in half, and each half has the same proportions as the whole, folding would be elegant forever. The ratio that allows this is the square root of 2, about 1 to 1.414. Take a sheet with that shape, fold it in half on the short side. The halves are not just halves. They are smaller versions of themselves, with edges that continue the same conversation. This is an idea that makes geometry feel like a calming habit, like rinsing a cup in the same direction every day. The proposal waits until a century wants it. That century is the 20th, which likes trains to run on time and envelopes to be predictable. Enter DIN 476 in Germany, and later ISO 216 internationally. The S-series. O is defined to have an area of 1 square meter and the 1 square root 2 proportions. A1 is half that area, A2 half again, and so on. A3, A4, A5. A ladder of foldings, you can climb down until the rungs turn into note cards. There is no need to round a corner. You only have and have and have a hypnosis for stationery. The miracle, if you allow mild miracles, is that all the numbers play kindly with one another. 2 sheets of a 4 laid together make an A3, and a 3 folded is an A4 that fits an envelope called C4, designed with the same ratio so the paper doesn't squabble with the envelope's interior. An invoice slips in, a corner doesn't sigh. Printers, who have opinions, appreciate that scaling by 141% takes a 4 to a 3 without introducing white borders that feel like indecision. Photocopiers learn these numbers by heart the way dogs learn the sound of the treat drawer. Office workers discovered that pressing A3 on a machine makes the machine hum approvingly, which is the closest thing modern life has to ritual. If you need a sleepy punchline, here is one. A 4 is 210 by 297 millimeters, which looks arbitrary until you remember that O sides must multiply to 1 million square millimeters and keep the 1 square root 2 ratio. The decimals fall where they must, like breadcrumbs for people who enjoy breadcrumbs. In the countries that adopt this system, many do, one stalwart does not paper drawers standardize. Diaries standardize. Hole punches find their perfect spacing for ring binders, which could be a love story if told from the binder's point of view. Cloudy mornings in offices begin to sound alike as reams are opened with that soft hiss, 1,000 sheets taking their first breath together. A 4 becomes the unit of ordinary. B-series sizes exist 2 slightly larger, used for posters and passports. C-series for envelopes, growing like nesting dolls that remember math. If you stack an A-series to the ceiling, the stack respects itself at every height. It is a system that never surprises you, which is a rare kindness. Outside the system, the United States still measures in inches because that is a habit that refuses to move out. Letter remains 8.5 by 11. Legal adds length for the comfort of footnotes, and nobody remembers which foot needed the extra room. The myth says it was watermarks. Another myth credits a vice president. Yet another says the mold was simply convenient. Myths coexist like houseplants on different windowsills, each convinced the light is better where it is. Engineers grit their teeth quietly when they must scale and forward drawing to letter and lose a margin like a sock in a dryer. Printers adjust settings. Everyone survives. The world is very good at surviving asymmetry. In a Japanese office, a 4 slides into a folder with a satisfying snugness. In a Boston office, letter sits in a drawer that likes to stick. The difference does not start wars. It starts conversations about print to fit, which in the wild means shrink until nothing complains. The charm of paper is how many small, earnest jobs it performs while pretending to be simple. A bill wants to fold in thirds so it fits a business envelope. The fold marks are faintly visible if you squint because machines remember where to crease. A ticket insists on heavier stock so that pockets don't bruise it. The thickness is expressed in grams per square meter, and there is a set called 80 GSM that is the everyday bread of the office. Thicker sheets are for covers. Thinner ones are a whisper. Margins keep behaving like moats. If you ever wondered why printers suggest leaving at least 5 millimeters unprinted at the edge, the reason is that machines dislike ink at the cliff. They prefer a calm shoreline. Bleed is a promise to trim after printing, which is how magazines end up with photographs that run to the very edge without falling off into the wheat field. The vocabulary is domesticated drama, bleed, crop, gutter, widow, orphan. A typesetter speaks of orphans with the same tired affection a school teacher reserves for the child who will not stop arriving at the end of the line. A small curiosity, just to keep the rhythm. Paper sizes can be weighed without a scale if you know your grams per square meter, because an AO sheet has exactly 1 square meter of area. Not all paper histories occur in nice dry rooms. There are mills by rivers that know the smell of wet wood and chlorine, and there are machines the size of trains that turn pulp into continuous webs, which are then cut into sheets that will never meet the river again. The Fredrinier machine hums like rain that remembers it as water. Calendars spelled with an E. Rollers that smooth press the sheets until they agree to be uniformly polite. The paper dries in an ordered hurry and waits in reams wrapped in brown jackets, whose creases look like reliable thoughts. Someone invented the tear strip that opens a ream in one motion. Someone else invented the painful version that tears halfway and sulks. In warehouses, pallets of A4 sit like very well-behaved geese. In courtrooms, legal size sits up straighter because it knows its destiny is margins with opinions. Specialized niches persist. Architects still love a 1 and AO for drawings because scale likes breathing room. Notebooks flirt with B5 because it is nicely between A5 and a 4 in a way that looks good next to coffee. When we slip back to earlier centuries to examine folding again, the words return: folio, quarto, octavo. Each is a memory of a larger sheet, deciding how small it wishes to be when it grows into a book. Folio volumes have presence, like tall people who sit carefully on fragile chairs. Quarto is comfortable, the armchair of sizes, and octavo fits a pocket that expects adventures no more risky than a walk. 18th century auctions list libraries by these words, and thereby summarize volumes' ambitions. A quarto atlas insists on a wide table. An octavo sermon fits a coat. Imposition schemes diagram little boxes with page numbers that look wrong until the fold makes them right. A kind of humble magic that printers keep in their back pockets next to bits of twine. The fold, not the number, is the plot twist. We rarely notice the diplomacy paper performs. A 4 promises a meeting handout will look like every other handout, and the sameness lubricates days the way oil quiets a hinge. Standardization is not a prison so much as it is the shape of a reliable cup. People pour. The European Union adopts ISO sizes as if signing a treaty in stationery. Countries list them in laws. Contracts mention them. Shipping companies build boxes to their proportions and experience fewer arguments about corners. Now and then someone prints in a 4-form on letter, and the signature line wanders down a few millimeters like a slightly lost tourist. Nobody calls security. A pen finds a place to sign. The dossier closes with a sigh that could be happiness. You can, if you like, match the sizes to everyday objects. A business card is roughly an 8. A flyer that feels generous is a 5. A poster that announces a bake sale in a trusting neighborhood is a 3 taped to a window that doesn't lock. Children produce masterpieces on a 4 and tape them to the refrigerator, which maintains a private gallery unmatched by the Louvre in the category of sincere blobs. A single of 4 folded into thirds becomes a plane that, with enough optimism, crosses a living room to applause. The aerodynamics favor gliding rather than ambition, which is an allegory if you squint. When adults discover that a 3 is exactly 2 A4 South side by side, they experience the briefest joy in a world otherwise confusing. The ratio that keeps the family together does its work like a good thermostat, invisibly until it breaks, which it seldom does. There is one last detail to place under your pillow. The edges we take for granted clean, square, are cousins of the deco edge. That soft, feathery border left by the wooden frame of handmade sheets. Luxury stationery keeps it on purpose now and then, as if to say, I remember being water. You can run a finger along. It and feel irregularity argue politely with the habit of the knife. Standards did not kill idiosyncrasy. They just gave it a vacation calendar. Somewhere a letter on a 4 sits next to a poem on handmade crown with a decal that looks like a coastline at low tide, and the desk accepts them both. The envelope remembers which flap to lick. The pen remembers to be kind. If you are still awake, breathe exactly as long as it takes to say 200 and 10 by 297 in your head, because that is how long it takes a 4 to feel familiar. Think of Lichtenberg's ratio folding itself again and again like a bedsheet that cooperates. N of mill workers stretching molds to their arm's length and calling it a day because it was. Imagine an office drawer that glides without noise, the ream that opens in one pull, the little chorus of holes punched just so, and the way a page slides into an envelope and sits there without crumpling because someone a century ago considered the square root of 2 in the area of a meter and thought kindly that matching would be nice. You can let the sizes line up in your mind like calm tiles on a floor. A A1, A2, A4, A5, smaller and smaller, the same in the same paper, making a path so even that walking it feels like rest. You might not expect an entire civilization to spend centuries deciding which numbers to paint on the spines of sleepy books, but that is more or less the story of libraries, and it is surprisingly gentle. If you re still awake by the time we reach the part where a single dot between 2 digits decides whether a cookbook lives on the left or the right, feel free to subscribe, or simply allow the thought to file itself under drowsy and go wherever overdue dreams are shelved. Long before labels, before tidy stacks and beeping gates, there was a room, a bench, and a chain. A medieval librarian tied books to iron rails with links because books wandered, and librarians like things that come back on time. The volumes were large and wore their spines inward. The edges faced out, lettered in a hand that knew Latin even when the reader did not. Shelf marks were not addresses so much as little stage directions. Press A, Shelf 3, Book 7. The script ran up the foredge like a narrow banner. If a monk reached for a life of a saint and tugged the wrong chain, an apology clinked across the room. It is comforting to know that misshelving has always produced a small sound. The Renaissance arrived with cabinets, and books stood up a little straighter. Libraries learned to keep lists, and lists learned to keep order. Each press had a number. Each shelf had a letter. The librarian's memory carried the rest the way a baker carries oven times. A shelf list sat on a podium like a quiet oracle. The entries were brief and practical. Large Bible, commentaries, a treatise on winds. Everyone trusted that the person who had seen the shelves yesterday would be the person who saw them tomorrow, which is one way to avoid inventing a system. Then printing multiplied books the way yeast multiplies, and the human mind did something we recognize from our desks. It ran out of corners to put things in. Libraries grew. New rooms opened like annexes built by polite afterthought. The shelf marks stretched until they could not stretch any farther without turning into snakes. Someone with good handwriting started adding dates. The 19th century loved systems the way gardeners love rows. Enter the age of classification, not as thunder, but as graphite. A man in Massachusetts, fond of neatness and bicycles, proposed that knowledge could be shelved in 10 broad regions and then divided forever by decimals, which are like polite scissors. His name was Melville with no second L, which is the kind of detail catalogers admire. Religion received a number. Science received a number. Literature crowded in with many numbers and a fondness for decimals that require a pencil sharpener. The magic trick of this decimal plan is that you can keep adding digits until the book finds a home that fits like a good drawer. Astronomy sits at 520, then stars at 523, then specific stars by decimals that behave themselves even when the heavens do not. A book on comets can live at 523.6 and not be mistaken for a meteor, which might enjoy 523.51 if anyone feels the need. The decimal point is the library's whisper. Move me a little to the right, it says, and you may sleep easier. A small absurdity keeps the rhythm lively. Folktales gravitate to 398.2, which readers discover by accident while hunting fairy godmothers. Mysteries about unsolved phenomena clump politely around 1.9, which makes the haunted shelf very close to the shelf for handwriting analysis, which feels appropriate if you don't think about it. Cookbooks, cheerful and flowery, gather at 641, while etiquette manuals glimmer at 395 and never spill on themselves. This is not law, it is choreography. In one library, the chess manuals sit with sports. In another, they sit with logic, which makes them look serious and cannot improve anyone's endgame. The decimals accept either choice with a shrug. They were designed for mood swings. The decimal plan, practiced long enough, acquires local accents. To squeeze authors together in a friendly way, librarians reach for a set of tables of letters and numbers that turn names into tidy codes. These are called cutters after a thoughtful cataloger, and they behave like surnames written by arithmetic. Shakespeare becomes S527 in one pattern, or S52 in a different one, and then Hamlet rests at 822.3337 without getting lost in a sea of tragedies. It looks cryptic if you have not slept, but the effect is soothing if you have. A shelf reads like a small street of little houses with rational addresses. Neighbors stay neighbors. Visitors can knock once and be welcomed by the right scene. The cutter promises you have not wandered into the wrong living room. Meanwhile, across the ocean and in the reading rooms of a Congress that enjoys long schedules, another method grew, more lettered than numbered. Here, the alphabet offers districts, and letters turn into fields. Q means science, R means medicine. H keeps the economists from arguing with the historians across the hall. The letters multiply with another letter and then numbers until a subject resolves into coordinates. The result is elegant in a different way, like a map with detail at the edge. A book about the nervous system might settle in QP, next to neighbors that breathe at regular intervals. A book about dictionaries will be Z, which is a strange address that makes sense once you notice how bibliographies like to live at the end. The United States prefers the lettered streets. Europe often prefers decimals. The world keeps both, which is both a problem and the kind of plural affection libraries were built to endure. However, the overall plan is chosen. Every book must be born into the catalog. The ritual is old and often faintly absurd. A book arrives without a home, wrapped in a slip with purchase notes, and sometimes the neat stamp of a foundation. It receives an accession number, which is not a location, but a birthday written in code. The librarian inspects the title page the way a tailor inspects seams. Is the subtitle long and proud or short and shy? Who's the publisher and on which street? Does the series claim kinship with any long-running family of texts? A pencil notes these facts in a small place, or a keyboard enters them where keyboards like to keep things. Subject headings arrive like gentle tags. The book nods. It knows it will be mentioned again many years later by someone who will not run their thumb along its bottom edge in quite the same way. Labels are printed. There is a satisfying click when the guillotine on the labeler chops a column of tiny white rectangles. The cutter code sits below the class number as if it were an apartment inside a building that was itself inside a neighborhood. Some libraries add the year, which makes entire shelves sound like local weather reports. 2012 enjoys rain. 1998 is very sure of itself. Size marks appear in quiet corners of the label because tall books cause anxiety if they pretend to be short. In older collections, the edges might be stamped in red with the class number, as if the book had insisted on getting a tattoo while young. Newer volumes wear barcodes and sometimes a square of silver that speaks to the gate. The conversation at the doorway is not dramatic. It is the exchange of small facts. The gate says, "Are you on the list?" The book hums yes and passes. Shelving is a choreography that requires shoes that don't squeak. The new book travels on a cart past places where people work with soft eyebrows. It studies its neighbors before it sits. If it is a cookbook about bread at 641.815, it makes friends with yeast and pretends not to notice pastry. If it is a memoir by a botanist, the librarian decides whether the narrative takes precedence over the plant. That decision is a microscopic philosophy, enacted daily and forgotten by mid-afternoon. Books are alphabetized by the cut of their letters. A is eager, M is prevalent. Blobby clusters with opinions. The librarian nudges a centimeter here, a centimeter there, until the row breathes. When a run is full, the shelf shifts along a notch, and the small metal bookends change posture. If you have ever wondered why librarians prefer you not to reshelve, it is partly because your kindness will be too generous, and near is not always the same as home. The catalog itself has changed costumes many times, but keeps the same lines. Once it was a forest of little wooden drawers, each full of cards that made tidy sounds. A pencil traveled across them like a modest train. The paper carried subject, title, author, and a code. People bent at the waist to consult it, which made whole reading rooms identical in silhouette. Then terminals arrived and made the consultation private, which pleased some and saddened others who liked to be seen pondering Z. The software speaks Mark and other dialects that describe books and fields with numbers that never smile. The metadata is a kindness pretending to be stern. It tells a future machine how to behave when someone types the word beekeeping or metaphor at 2 a.m. Every field has a purpose. If you were to remove the tiny subfield code for place of publication, nothing tragic would occur, but the world would be shakier than it needs to be. Signs on the ends of ranges are the library's weather vanes. One points to 730 to 739 and says sculpture with pleasant confidence. Another points to PS and says American literature and then lists letters that look like a ringing telephone. The paper for these signs is thick enough to stand up and thin enough to be replaced when a single, enthusiastic professor buys a new future for the Russian history section. Floor maps tell you where to find Q or 500s, or something called oversize that lives on the bottom where the shelves have more patience. Some libraries rotate whole ranges, which causes a mild earthquake for the books, but saves customers from hiking to the far wall to fetch geology. Moving a range is done with special wheels that slide under the case and lift it just enough to roll. When this happens at dawn, the books travel in their sleep. In the children's room, classification softens. Picture books refuse numbers and accept alphabet instead, which is not a rebellion so much as practical sociology. Little hands want to learn as well, pulling the 10th copy of a bear who wears a hat. In some places, colored dots appear on spines to help small eyes decide quickly. Green for early readers, yellow for chapter books. A dinosaur silhouette for dinosaurs. There's a purity to this, the way fruit is arranged by color in a quiet market. Later, when those readers grow taller, the decimals return with their calm suggestions. 567.9 waits with fossil smiles. 636.8 offers cats who look surprised that anyone needed a number at all. Special collections keep older habits alive. A 17th century Cordell will be shelved by size and press mark because the book cannot be forced into an ordinary run without feeling wrong in the hand. A map taller than a student will live in a drawer that grumbles when opened. Its call number is a phrase in an older language. Folio, case, drawer. The accession number wears the year proudly, separated by a small slash like a scissor mark. The bookplate inside the cover insists the book was donated in loving memory of someone who carried newspapers rolled like architecture. Edge stamping persists. Cloth ties keep calm. Gloves do not insist but appear if skin meets vellum. In this part of the library, the labels are as conservative as dinner with grandparents, and the clocks tick quietly, as if measuring dust. Borrowing is a different catalog that lives inside calendars. A card pocket on the rear end paper used to hold a list of due dates like tree rings. Now a receipt prints with a date that looks like a simple instruction to be responsible. The barcode identifies the copy, not just the title, the way friends identify one another by particular laughs. When the book returns, the machine listens and says thank you with a sound that would have delighted the monks who once counted chains. If the book does not return, the system whispers to the account and adds days. A fine accumulates very slowly, like sediment in a river. Many libraries have forgiven fines these days, which is a policy that feels like a librarian's version of amnesty. The shelf rejoices, or does not notice. Shelves do not carry grudges. Consider the curious journey of fiction. In some libraries, novels arrange themselves by author alphabet, and this is enough. In others, they accept a short label that announces genre, which is a costume party people enjoy. Mystery, romance, fantasy, western, all fine, all voluntary, all subject to debates that never end. A book with a detective set on Mars may find itself shelved as science fiction and walk over to visit mystery when someone mentions it at the desk. A patron who has opinions and a keen sense of shelf justice will eventually tell a librarian about the misplacement, and the librarian will thank them and perhaps move the book after they walk away. The shelf remains a conversation, updated in pencil. Nothing catastrophic occurs when a cowboy stands next to a dragon for a month. Edge cases give librarians their portion of daily spice. Where should a book of poems about astronomy reside? In poetry with a note in the catalog that says stars, or in astronomy with a note that says poems? What about a cookbook written in diary form? At 641 with a cheerful cutter for the author, or in biography where it will meet other lives written with butter? Someone decides. Someone else changes their mind 5 years later. The book does not mind. It wants hands. It wants eyes. It wants the small exhalation readers make when a sentence surprises them into nodding. Its label is a coordinate, not its reason for existing. Everything wears out. Labels yellow at the edges like autumn. Spines crack politely, asking for tape that is not too shiny. A librarian with a cart of mending supplies sits at a table and gives a book a new hinge the way a cobbler replaces a heel. The call number is rewritten in neat strokes. New barcode. The book returns to the shelf more grateful than before, if gratitude can be represented by a slightly firmer posture. Discards leave with stamps that say so. They go to sales on folding tables and find homes where numbers do not matter. A child chooses one because the cover shows a whale. The class number blushes in the summer sun and becomes irrelevant in a cheerful way. Technology makes small noises and does not disturb the nap. Radio tags identify themselves to antennas concealed in the doorway. Self-check machines light up their screens and ask for the card as if the patron were a frequent traveler boarding a flight. The computer behind the desk sings gently when a hold arrives. Titles march across queues like dignified parade floats. Staff print slips and tuck them where books like to keep secrets. The carts line up. Every cart is a temporary neighborhood. In the elevator, the books lean the way people do when gravity decides to introduce itself again between floors. If you follow the numbers down a row, you will learn another truth. Classification is not knowledge. It is furniture. The same book wears different numbers in different buildings, depending on how a community thinks about its questions. A manual on compost might sit with gardening or with environmental science. A memoir of illness might live with biographies or with medicine. The placement is a quiet vote. Librarians cast it with an eye on their readers. Systems are tools. Readers are reasons. Somewhere an experienced staffer moves an entire run of books. 2 bays over because students keep looking for them in the wrong place, and the wrong place is trying very hard to become the right place by sheer repetition. The sign changes. The map changes. The habits change. The decimals do not mind. They always wanted to be helpful. Late in the day, when paper dust settles into dignified sunlight and chairs straighten themselves, the numbers on the spines look like a skyline at rest. A4-size sheets announce due dates. Pencils surrender to cups. The date decides to ignore the last cart with kindness. A book about knots nestles between sailing and crafts and seems satisfied, which is as good a definition of equilibrium as any. If you listen very carefully, you can hear the decimals rebalancing themselves as new titles arrive, a breathing that is almost silent. Somewhere a slender volume with a pale jacket is waiting to be wrapped in a cover that will make it feel sturdier. The labeler warms, the guillotine clacks. The tiny white rectangle sticks to the spine as if it always intended to. The book joins its neighbors, shoulders aligned, title ready to be found by someone who did not know they were looking for exactly that number and that word. You could drift like a patron who came in for the catalog and stayed for the hum. You could consider the gentle ambition of putting the world on shelves and making it reachable by decimals, letters, and small codes that turn people's names into coordinates. You could imagine the monk's chain making way for a barcode, the 4-edge title inching round to the spine, the press mark stretching into the tidy address many of us learn the way we learn our street. And when the thought finishes, it does not end so much as shelf itself. The book remains available. The cart will return in the morning. Someone will open a drawer or a screen and find a call number that looks like a path. It will be a simple path, and it will be enough to follow in the half-light of a drowsy afternoon, where the only urgency is the turn of a page, and the only sound is the small confirmation a book makes when it is slid correctly into place. You might not think 5 ordinary words could behave like bricks in a wall and also like a whisper passed down a hallway for 2 millennia. But here we are, peering at a tiny Latin sentence that refuses to sit still. If you're still awake by the time the farmer shows up in the 3rd act to plow a field inside a grammar lesson, feel free to subscribe, or simply let the thought slide away like chalk dust on the school slate. In the soft half-light of history, a square appears. Sator aripo tenet opera rotus. 5 words. 5 letters each, arranged so they read the same forward, backward, up and down, like a polite crossword that never disagrees with itself. They turn up in places that smell of lamp smoke and old tools, scratched on a Roman column, inked in a monk's margin, carved into a farmhouse beam that has seen more winters than arguments. Scholars lean over it the way a sleepy cat leans over a sun puddle. The charm is not the translation, though there is one, but the way the words sit together, behaving like a gear that can turn in any direction without losing a tooth. The square has a favorite origin story that begins with heat and ash. In Pompeii, where time stopped because a mountain decided to count to 1, someone had scratched the 5-word sentence into a wall. The ash settled like a heavy blanket and kept the writing safe, which is the sort of housekeeping volcanoes provide by accident. When archaeologists brushed at the plaster with careful hands long after, the letters emerged like embers that had waited politely under the ash for their cue. Nothing about the inscription explains itself. It doesn't announce an author or advertise a bakery. It merely sits as content in Latin as a loaf cooling on a windowsill. The words are ordinary: sower, mysterious arepo, holds, works, wheels. Put together, they suggest something like the sower arepo keeps the wheels steadily at work. It's a sentence that seems to have wandered out of a field to lean against a wall and watch the street. Its quiet posture is why it survived. It offends no one. It does not boast. It does what letters do best: dash, persist, dot. From Pompeii, the square takes the slow roads of empire. It finds a new task as a traveler's talisman. It becomes doodled inside amphorae. It hides behind altars. In Britain, the same 5 words appear again, scratched by someone who had the time to scratch and the habit of repeating what pleased them. In Gaul, a tile carries the words like a souvenir. The letters do not match from place to place, but the intent is stubborn. Even the arrangement alters cheerfully. Sometimes the square runs as a single block, neat as a checkerboard. Sometimes the words drift down the page like a small staircase. Once in a while, a carver forgets which letter comes next and improvises. The sentence forgives the error because stone is forever and forever is generous. It is odd to think how many centuries have greeted the same little arrangement of letters with the same tolerant nod. You can picture hands tracing it, mouths sounding out the Latin like a password that never expires. People love a key, and the square invites all of them in. Here the second scene opens like a cupboard of speculations. When you take the 5 words and draw them in a perfect grid, you can read them in every direction, and that feels like a clue even if you don't know to what. Rearrange the letters and you can form Pater Noster, the Our Father laid out as a tidy, Latin cross with 2 straight A's and 2 O's left over, which some claim are the Alpha and Omega politely waiting in the wings. To a mind that likes hidden compartments, this is a triumph. To a skeptic, it is an example of what happens when you own a hat and keep looking for a head. Either way, it's endearing. The trick works only because the square is already a machine of symmetry. Its letters behave like polished stones that can be laid and relaid with soft clicks until a pattern appears to wink. The beautiful part of this theory is not whether it is true, but that people cared enough to see it. A charm that invites people to read more. Closely is a teacher that never raises its voice. Mathematicians approach from a different door. They admire the square's peculiar discipline palindromic in 4 directions, and nod at it the way tailors nod at a well-sewn scene. The device belongs to a larger family of symmetrical word games, which is not a scandal but a tradition. Think of it as a linguistic kaleidoscope. Rotate the tube and the same beads arrange themselves into a new rosette. Magic historians who catalog charms and household spells like birdwatchers catalog calls file the square near protective formulas. It pins to the page beside symbols scratched on thresholds to coax luck through the doorway. Farmers in alpine villages carve the words above stalls to keep cows content. Housewives chalk the square on the back of doors so that fevers would forget their appointment. A midwife might whisper the words on a cold night in a room where the only exciting event scheduled was a life, beginning exactly when it planned to. Micro hook. This was perhaps the first time a palindrome doubled as a blanket. Other keys are scholarly and therefore charmingly fussy. Some prefer to read Arepo not as a person but as an invented placeholder, like the Acme in old cartoons or the widget of economic thought. Others insist he is a real name, the way every neighborhood has one man everyone calls by both names, John Johnson, Arepo, because names do that. Some hear in Tenet a confession of faith. Others hear only the steady squeak of a wheelbarrow. Every interpretation returns eventually to the experience of seeing the square in the wild. You encounter it as a small, careful puzzle, fully formed, offering itself like a coin on a windowsill no one thinks to pocket. The mystery is not explosive. It is domestic. It lives by being repeated, the way a proverb lives not by being clever, but by being useful. Uses, then. The square earns its keep in all sorts of serious and mildly ridiculous ways. Medieval notebooks show it copied as a charm against thieves, which suggests a fond belief that burglars either knew Latin or were too polite to ignore warnings written in the classics. And a few recipe books for household magic, a genre, less about cauldrons and more about nettle tea and patience. The square is written on bread dough, then baked and eaten to drive away fevers. I do not recommend this as dinner, but I applaud the confidence. In barns, the words are carved into beams to safeguard fools and keep the measure of the seasons. In city courts, a bailiff's assistant might carry a token with the square etched on it, equal parts lucky coin and conversation starter. Charms have always been part placebo, part calendar. They occupy the space where we hope for help and tidy the day's anxieties into rows. The plainest of the 5 words plays the star. Sator means sower, the one who throws seed into the earth. Opera means works or effort, the slow labor of hands. Rotas are wheels, very much the sort you grace. Tenet is the statiest verb Latin can offer, a grip that does not tire. The oddity Arepo stands in the field like a scarecrow with a hat. If you let the sentence breathe, an image emerges so ordinary it becomes almost holy. A farmer, Arepo, keeps his wheels to their task. You can almost hear the creak of a cart and feel the late afternoon field give a little underfoot. It is the most unremarkable sentence, and therefore the most durable. The Romans loved proverbs that were really observations pretending to be advice. This one offers a motto no empire can argue with. Keep at it. If the square had been about famous heroes and handsome gods, it would be far more fragile, because it is about effort and wheels. It has outlived practically everything. Sometimes the square was copied into church registers as if it were a curious secular cousin of the liturgy, tolerated because it behaved. There are stories soft, unprovable, lullabies shaped about the square written on parchment and placed under tongue or pillow for relief from nightmares. There are instructions for writing the words in a circle and spinning them to determine the guilty party in a petty theft, which feels unfair to everyone except the circle. Long before Sudoku, there were small pleasures in arranging letters and giving them jobs. The 5 words offer tiny, repeatable theater. Lay them down, read them in 4 directions, smile at the trick, feel safer than you did a minute ago. Asterisk, the farmer returns as promised, with a grammar lesson built into his cart. Arepo is said by some to be a nonsense name, chosen because it contains the right letters. That makes him a placeholder, a everyman, a test name, the way forms require one. Yet copyists in different centuries kept him, never replacing him with Marcus or Caius or another Ramon who might have worn a ring. This fidelity suggests affection. After all, if you carry a puzzle across 1,000 years, you carry the flavor of its first telling too. People pictured the sower. They meant him to be steady. They wanted his wheels to keep turning because the wheat on the table depended on it. A charm that honors labor is the sort of superstition even skeptics can forgive. Soft punchline, the most effective ancient spell, may have been 8 hours of honest work. Our last scene prefers the laboratory to the barn, but keeps the same slowness. Modern readers test the square the way curious children test a compass, turning it this way and that to see if the needle still points to north. Paleographers compare letter forms. Epigraphers tally where copies appear and what stone they chose. Code breakers peek at it, considering whether anything so symmetrical could hide more than it already shows. Computer scientists feed the letters to programs designed to find patterns and watch the same old miracle happen. The words read themselves contentedly, forward and back, exactly as advertised. Every decade or two, someone proposes a new translation that is either modest or heroic. The heroic translations are fun, with gods and doctrines woven in like silver thread. But the modest ones feel truer to the object we can touch. The sower Arepo keeps the works, the wheels, the care of his effort. You don't need incense to believe it. The strongest science keeps the quiet if in its pocket. If this inscription is early, then the spread tells us something about merchants drifting through provinces with good pens. If it is later, then it teaches us about monks who liked old toys and copied them carefully into new books. If the square carried Christian echoes, then its presence on a wall near a market says something about belief that liked to hide in plain sight. If it did not, then we still have the pleasure of a Roman sentence that wandered the centuries like a dandelion seed and settled wherever there was a gap in plaster and a moment to be amused. Each hypothesis is a well-made coat. We try them on and put them back on the peg without malice. The square offers any number of decent explanations and requires none of them. Archaeologists sometimes find a square that has been drawn wrong letters inverted, lines miscounted, and these are quietly my favorites. They prove that people met the magic halfway and were not terrified of imperfection. A crooked palindrome cannot repel more fleas than a straight one, but it can say, a person stood here with a soft blade, invented a ruler with their fingernail, and made a small symmetrical garden out of letters. The square, even when it wobbles, holds. That word tenet does its faithful work across time. It holds in the ash of Pompeii. It holds beside a British road where cart ruts still press down a little in the earth. It holds in an alpine loft that smells of hay. It holds in a museum case where children lean without realizing their noses are leaving faint signatures on the glass dot. Every so often, a newspaper prints an article declaring the square solved at last. Like a crossword finished on a Sunday, these are pleasant, and it would be churlish to take away anyone's moment of definitive clarity. But the square is one of those historical objects that thrives on not needing to be solved. Its function is gently social. It gives us an excuse to gather around a piece of stone and discuss what we think words do when no one is watching. Its permanence is not a fact of rock, but a habit of repetition. You copy it because someone else copied it. It persists because a wheel persists, round and round, creaking a little, always arriving back where it began, before you sleep. Consider how small a structure can be and still carry meaning across continents and empires. 5 words, not particularly rare, arranged like tiles that know one dance. They outlived their maker and then outlived the city where they first became famous, because ash can be a kind of envelope. They invited arguments without causing injuries. They were useful for goats and for ghosts. They fit on a door lintel, but also inside a pocket. If a spell is simply a sentence worn smooth by hope, then this may be the most reasonable spell ever cast. Keep the works. Hold the wheels. Do your labor. Let the cart arrive at the gate when the gate is ready. And now, as the room grows dimmer, picture the letters again, soft in their squared garden. Sator on the top, Rhoda's on the bottom, Arebo and Opera leaning in toward that calm verb in the middle that keeps its arms outstretched tenet steady as a hand resting on a shoulder. Read them one way, read them the other, and then let them read themselves while you drift. The puzzle does not object to being left unsolved. It has been content for 2,000 years to be an agreeable, repeating thing. The sower keeps his wheels. The work keeps its rhythm. The words keep their shape. And the night keeps moving past the window, quietly, as if it too were tracing the square, one slow letter at a time. You might not expect a single squash word to spend 2,000 years pretending to be a picture of itself, but here we are, looking at the ampersand, the tidy curlicue that means, and that sits on grocery lists like a paperclip holding two grapes together. If you're still awake by the time we get to Victorian shop signs with gilded ampersands, you can subscribe, or you can let that decision nap politely next to you, as flexible as the character itself. The story of this symbol is not dramatic. No empires fall. Nobody duels over a pen stroke. It is a history of habits, the sort you learn so slowly you forget there was a time before them. The ampersand begins as a shy ligature, the Latin word et, hand in hand, walking too close, and ends up as a single character on keyboards and storefronts, always meaning as well as always leaning companion ably. The first scene opens in a room that smells like papyrus dust and lamp oil. Roman scribes, unhurried professionals with wrists trained for long afternoons, write eddy, so often that the letters begin to behave like neighbors who share a fence. The cross of the T reaches back and hugs the E, and soon the pair fuse into a single motion. If you watch a fast hand, you can see the ligature happen, a curve, a loop, a finishing flick, and the ink delivers a small knot that says, and without needing to say it twice. We have surviving letters from Pompeii with this casual shortcut, which means someone wrote an ampersand before the mountain interrupted the mail. On stone inscriptions, the ligature appears shyly, an exception among serious capitals, like a wink in an otherwise straight-faced paragraph. No one announces a new character. It simply occurs the way a path appears through grass when enough feet agree about a destination. Monks adopt it next, as they adopt most of writing cautiously, tidily, with the patience of people who plan to pass on what they copy. In early medieval manuscripts, et swings between two moods. Sometimes it remains obediently separate, crisp as cold water. Sometimes it curls into the familiar loop, especially in the marginal jottings where a scribe is allowed to be himself for half a line. Micro Hook, one 12th century scribe, drew a small face into the curl, which suggests that even in cloisters diversions existed, as harmless as daisies. Over centuries, the ligature grows a waist and then loses it. In Carolingian hands, it is narrow and quick, like thread slipping through a needle. In Gothic script, it fattens into something that looks like a pretzel with opinions. There are brief periods when it resembles the figure 8 that fell asleep and forgot to stand up. It always means the same thing, but its costume changes depending on who is cooking the ink that century. If you trace the evolution of the mark across a room of manuscripts, you can watch a habit become infrastructure. In chancery hands, the fast government writing of late medieval Europe, the ampersand is efficient. Clerks copying contracts cannot waste time writing separate letters if a convenient knot will do. The symbol looks like a little road sign in a text full of words, a promise that another item follows without any fuss. As printing presses arrive, typecutters must decide which marks are worth their precious metal. They keep the ampersand. Of course they do. It saves space. It pleases the eye. It already belongs to readers the way a familiar corner belongs to everyone who walks that way home. A few printers design flamboyant versions, loops tangled into noble knots. The sort you see on title pages where the word "and" joins two names and raises its eyebrows, mildly as if introducing polite companions who will agree with one another in public dot by the 16th century. Children encounter the mark at school. In old alphabets after Z, the teacher adds "and" per se, and meaning the character is pronounced "and" by itself. Said quickly by a distracted classroom, children are good at that, it becomes ampersand. The name is a mistake so common it graduates into correctness. It is not the only time this happens in English, but it may be the friendliest example. The ampersand becomes official without a coronation. It is taught like a letter while secretly not being one, the way a cousin attends reunions without ever technically joining the family tree. The symbol appears on shop signs, Brown and Sons, where it acts as glue holding surnames together like staves in a barrel. Lawyers adore it for its brevity on firm letterheads. Printers keep inventing new shapes, some wide, some narrow, some elegant as swans. The ampersand handles all of this without complaint, always meaning, and never asking for more dot. The next scene is about uses and the slow choreography of ordinary marks. Ampersands thrive in titles, in commerce, on recipe cards that read "butter and sugar" with a snug intimacy you do not get from "and." In marriage records, they stand between names with a certain municipal gravitas. In plays, they link acts and scenes with a theatrical flourish. Printers sometimes use a different ampersand just for stage directions, as if the character itself has gone backstage to put on something looser. In 19th century shorthand, the ampersand is sometimes simplified yet again, scrunched into a shape that one could write while a train car bumps on winter tracks. Children drawing treasure maps discover the symbol early because it is fun to make and the treasure involves. Both gold and snacks dot, there is a quietly comedic moment when a symbol designed for handwriting enters the telegraph. Early operators, billing by the word, discover that "and" counts as a word, which is frankly unfair to thrifty minds. Some companies charge extra for its use, declaring it exotic. Operators adjust by typing "and" to save money, which means the ampersand is temporarily abandoned in an environment that ought to have adored it. It does not sulk. It waits for typewriters and then for the first keyboards, after which it returns as a matter of course, perched above the number 7 where one's fingers can find it easily. A small, obliging bird ready to land between companions. Micro hook. The earliest films of office typing pools show clerks hitting the ampersand with tiny ceremony, as if pressing a doorbell that let two words into the same room dot. As we move to typography, the ampersand becomes a playground. Every typeface designer has to draw one. The special difficulty is that it must belong to the font and also show off a little. A utilitarian sans serif ampersand looks like a clean knot tied by someone in a hurry. A Baroque serif ampersand looks like a treble clef that fled the staff to take a day off. Some designers hide jokes inside. In Caslon, the lower loop seems to wink. In Baskerville, it stands like a gentleman with a walking stick. In italic forms, it leans forward like a conspirator. In display types for posters, it becomes spectacular, looping like pastry. Wedding invitations recruit the most ornate ampersands available, confident that no guest will complain a symbol upstage the couple. Meanwhile, accounting ledgers prefer the small simple one because figures are jealous and do not like to be overshadowed by punctuation dot. There is also the strange little tribe of people who collect ampersands. They frame them on studio walls. A gallery of graceful minimalisms and in wood and in iron, and in neon rescued from a bar that took down its sign in 1973. The obsession is harmless and touching, like collecting leaves from the same species of tree in a dozen different seasons. The ampersand is one of the rare typographic marks that can stand alone as art without pretending to be more than it is. It does not carry moral slogans. It does not require context. It simply invites and-ness, which is a restful concept, the opposite of fuss. A person can look at a wall of ampersands and feel that everything cooperates, at least typographically. For a moment, our third scene wanders into accidental politics and dusty corners where small marks change tone. In contracts, and/or becomes a funny legal bird, and with an optional wing. For decades, style guides try, gently, to restrain it because and/or is often a sign that a writer has not decided something important. The ampersand remains neutral. It makes no claims beyond connection. In companies that rename themselves, the difference between and becomes weirdly emotional. Marketing teams test both as if they were shoes. Meanwhile, in academic titles, and is sometimes frowned upon as informal, a rule enforced with size. And on the internet, people rediscover the symbol's power to conserve space, especially when usernames are stingy. Nothing about these skirmishes threatens the ampersand's existence. It does what old useful things do. It survives by being ordinary, a mildly absurd fact. In the early days of alphabetization, when children recited letters out loud, the class would end with Z and per se and, which misheard and repeated, congealed into the word ampersand. This means that the symbol's name is a fossil of a classroom mumble. There is something lovely about a name that is not chosen by decree, but formed like a pearl around a small linguistic accident. Another oddity, sailors' tattoos sometimes included ampersands between names of sweethearts and ships, implying companionable loyalties. One still sees antique serving spoons engraved M and J, where the ampersand, stout and engraved, looks sturdier than either letter. On tins of biscuit assortments, British ones especially, the and appears like a brass buckle securing the nouns. The character has a gift for looking trustworthy in metal. Typographers of the 20th century, even the very stern ones, could not resist at least one wild ampersand per career. Eric Gill's is famously peculiar, a tangle that knows it is attractive. Jan Chickle designed ampersands that look as if they might walk off a page and become punctuation ballet dancers. On the other end of the scale, digital bitmap fonts squeeze the mark into a square grid of pixels where it resembles a small animal seen from a distance. Through all these stylizations, the original "et" haunted the shape. If you stare long enough at almost any ampersand, you can unroll it and find the old Latin word sleeping inside like a cat in a basket. That hidden word keeps the symbol honest. It is not entirely decoration. It is an abbreviation with a memory. The last scene turns down the lights and sits with the ampersand in modern quiet. On phones, it shrinks into a polite button. In code, it is employed for entirely different things, logical conjunctions, addresses of memory, yet even there, it means connection in a serious uniform. Street names and subway maps use it as a space saver, but also because its shape provides a visual rest between cramped downs. Designers still audition ampersands when choosing brand identities, weighting them like fruit in a market to see which one feels ripe. And handwriting, a surprising number of people invent forms that are not correct and are still understandable, a reminder that this character is indulgent with us. It accepts our approximations. You can draw an ampersand the way you would draw a swirl of steam, and everyone will understand. Consider, too, how the ampersand is used in love notes. It stands in for the long breath between two names, humbly promising togetherness without trumpets. No one writes Romeo and Juliet with an ampersand, not unless they're staging a modern performance, but on the back of a math notebook, two initials joined with and feel proper and private. The mark ages well. Its curves can look antique or sleek, depending on the grain of the paper. It does not argue with other letters. It chooses harmony as a profession. In the world of punctuation, where question marks inquire and exclamation points protest, the ampersand is the friend who holds a door. A small scientific aside fits here, because even calming digressions are pleasant at bedtime. When you write the ampersand, often muscle memory builds a loop in the wrist. Penmanship manuals from the 19th century include gentle lectures on how to avoid over-flourishing the mark lest it topple into illegibility. Teachers recommended practicing it 40 times while thinking calm thoughts. It was not a superstition, merely a practical method for training the hand to make an elegant shortcut. I suspect many students, bored and decent, found that the 40 ampersands had the same effect as counting woolly animals that leap politely over a fence. It is hard to be angry while drawing an and. The stroke requires a cooperative little dance between upstrokes and downstrokes. And when the dance ends, the paper is adorned with a connector that did not exist a breath ago. Sometimes, late at night, I think the ampersand's real secret is that it grants permission. It whispers that sentences need not choose only one thing. They can be this and that. A life can be work and rest, tea and toast, patience and curiosity. The symbol is a grammatical kindness. It is also a small museum of handwriting, preserving the moment where rhyming E and T fused to save effort and created beauty almost by accident. If you go looking for too much meaning, you will frighten away its charm. It is best appreciated the way you appreciate a well-worn doorknob, by using it somewhere on your desk. Perhaps there is a notebook with an ampersand already in it, between tasks on a to-do list, linking errands that cheerfully coexist. Somewhere in a museum case lies a stone where "and once stood in for et," souvenir of a clerk whose lunch went too long. Somewhere an old shop sign, gilded and sturdy, lists two surnames with a symbol in the middle that made a partnership look permanent. You can fall asleep knowing that, while punctuation sometimes argues with grammar and grammar sometimes argues with poetry, the ampersand has almost no enemies. It only connects. It has one job and it likes doing it dot, and so we drift to the simple picture. 2 strokes loop and clasp. The motion's so economical it feels like a nap turned into ink. You can repeat it on air with your finger, and the shape will arrive like a familiar staircase turned into a doodle. When morning comes, the same character will sit ready on your keyboard, above the 7, as unflappable as ever. Words will approach one another, and it will step between them, study small content, making a quiet bridge you hardly notice as you cross it. You might not expect the smallest marks at the bottom of a page to have a life of their own, but the footnote has been working a quiet night shift for centuries, padding around in tiny shoes, dusting facts, and leaving little stepping stones for anyone still awake. If you're still with me by the time we discuss 18th century printers arguing about dagger shapes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I assume you nodded politely and drifted into a pleasant disagreement with the pillow. Footnotes are a domestic arrangement between a page and the margins. The main text lives upstairs and behaves, while the notes live downstairs and whisper. Nothing dramatic happens here. There are no fireworks, only a series of small lamps that make it possible to wander safely after hours. The earliest versions were not notes at all, just a considerate gesture known to scribes as a gloss, a small word written above a larger one, as if standing on tiptoe to explain it. In medieval scriptoria, parchment was expensive and commentary was shy, so monks wrote remarks in a careful nest around the sacred lines north, south, east, and west of the text, like a monastery with cloisters on every side. If you tilt certain manuscripts, you can see the family resemblance, the solemn central block, and then tidy murmurs in smaller hands, sometimes in red ink, sometimes in a half-erased brown that looks like the color of old tea. A micro hook here, one 14th century reader drew a tiny fish in the margin to warn future readers that the word above was slippery. No one scolded him. Margins have always been the page's permissive ant dot it took printing to create the two-story house we still live in. Printers in the 16th century discovered that scholars had too much to say to be contained in those friendly halos around the text. The solution, both practical and sleepy, was to banish extra remarks to the basement and invite them back with symbols. An asterisk sent you down. A dagger escorted you farther. Then came the double dagger, the section sign that looks like a double curled ribbon, the parallel lines that behave like a pair of little fences, and when all else failed, ordinary numbers. A quiet revolution. Information was now sorted vertically. You could read the main sentences like a peaceful river, or you could climb down the staircase of symbols and inspect the stones under the water. Printers liked the elegance. Readers enjoyed the illusion of choice. Authors, of course, learned they could save their favorite gossip for downstairs dot in this polite arrangement. The first footnote was often an apology. Writers used it to say, "I remember, but you needn't," or "I have proof, but I will not make a spectacle of it." Slowly, footnotes forgot to apologize and began to gossip with confidence. 17th century historians tucked away legends they did not entirely believe. Natural philosophers hid measurement details small as seeds. Lawyers packed the bottom of the page like a pantry shelf during a long winter. The scholar Pierre Bell, famous for an encyclopedic mind and impatience with brevity, more or less converted footnotes into an additional book that happened beneath the book. His notes were not addenda but parallel lanes. You could read the top of this page for a calm walk, or the bottom for the scenic route past 3 controversies and a polite quarrel. Typography gave the footnote a wardrobe. Asterisks were stars for points too small to deserve earthly numbers. Daggers and double daggers were dignified, appropriate for somber matters like death dates or disputed titles. Some printers called them obelus and diasis because Latin warms the hands, and certain Oxford men performed the Latin as if it tasted like sherry. The backward-leaning section mark section was useful for legal matters, and always looked to me like a polite snake who learned calligraphy. As the 19th century went on, numerals won because they were tidier, and because asterisks tend to multiply when anxious. Still, every compositor kept a drawer of special symbols for days when the ordinary would not do. One eccentric journal even used a tiny pointing hand, the manicule, to herd readers across a page. It was shaped like a gentleman inviting you to tea, one finger extended, the rest in a courteous fist. Every system requires rituals of navigation. The guardians of the footnote invented rules that nobody regrets and everybody forgets. The note number sits at the end of his sentence, not before the punctuation, like a well-mannered visitor who waits for the host to finish speaking. The corresponding number descends to the bottom where the world becomes small and precise. Fonts shrink. Line spacing tightens. Time slows. The eye performs a little commute, down and back up, like a lift connecting a shop with its storeroom. It has a soothing rhythm, and if you are reading in bed, the up and down motion behaves like the world's smallest rocking chair. Another micro hook in an 18th century cookbook. A note at the bottom calmly advises the reader that venison pie keeps best if one forgets it for 2 days. An instruction that belongs under the stairs. Not all note makers were serene. Some turned the basement into a club for arguments that could not afford daylight. Edward Gibbon, precise as a clock with lace, placed his sharpest remarks below the line. There, historians and bishops were corrected with the kind of sweetness that stings more than a shout. A generation later, German scholars developed the footnote into an academic infrastructure so reliable you could build a bridge on it. Their notes specified manuscripts, editions, page numbers, line numbers, variant readings. the weather, and sometimes the calisthenics schedule of a medieval abbot. It sounds thrilling. It was not, and that was the point. Boredom is a technology. If you make your evidence dull enough, only committed adversaries will follow you down the stairs, and they will arrive polite because the descent took time. The 19th century also created the footnote as personality. In travel books, notes recorded prices of piers, heights of church towers, and whether laundresses charged extra for ruffles. In novels, an occasional author used a footnote to flirt with the reader. Stern did it. Nabokov did it later, turning annotations into a mirror that laughed. But most writers kept the arrangement faithful and plain. Footnotes were for provenance, quantities, and careful contradictions that would upset a sentence if left upstairs. The tone of a good note is like a librarian's voice from behind a shelf. Accurate, helpful, and not surprised by anything. A weak note, by contrast, is merely a sigh in 6-point type that an entire species of scholar evolved to care about the punctuation inside notes. Should one write see also with colon or see also with a comma as soft as afternoon bread? Do we abbreviate ibid or say same work in full, trusting that the reader enjoys small acts of patience? Some journals forbade opposite on the grounds that it encouraged forgetfulness. Others praised it for conserving ink. The arguments resemble weather, recurring, and generally harmless. In one Victorian review, a contributor accused another of misplacing a dagger, one of those little cruciform signs, by a single item. The apology, set as a footnote to a footnote, there's the modest grandeur of a man moving a chess piece 2 squares back and admitting that the bishop has a longer memory than he does. Downstairs, notation developed upstairs consequences. Because notes take space, authors learn to budget facts as carefully as bakers budget sugar. A long string of footnotes at the start of a book is a kind of overture. It warns you whether the orchestra favors brass, strings, or percussion. Historians who depend on archives favor the everyday metal of numbers. Classicists, guardians of ancient thorns, still admire obelisks and asterisks like small funerary symbols. Scientists, economical people with a date at the lab, prefer parenthetical citations, names, and years folded into the sentence so that proof and claim travel together like twins. Yet, even in the laboratory, there are notes below, humbly announcing where a reagent came from or suggesting that someone's rabbit did not cooperate. Every technology produces a mess, and footnotes are no exception. The worst are called widows, notes that spill onto the next page like milk under a door, orphaned from the sentence they serve. Compositors invented tiny acrobatics to avoid this. They would stretch one line and shrink another, nudge a hyphen, or perform the elegant trick of using a hairspace, a gap so thin you can rent it cheaply. Endnotes were invented as a tidy solution notes gathered at the back like sensible luggage, but they interrupt the pleasant lift between top and bottom. You must leave the chapter, walk briskly to the station called Notes, and search for the number you dropped half a mile back. Readers often pretend to do this. Their bookmarked, tired of the commute, remains behind. That is why endnotes have a higher percentage of secret jokes. Fewer people notice them. The basement becomes a secluded garden. Digital life changed little, but accelerated everything. The bottom of a page on a screen is an approximation. The note appears as a pop-up, a small plate passed from a silent waiter. Hyperlinks are, arguably, footnotes that grew impatient and installed an escalator. Still, the old habits survive. Well-made online articles keep the symbols and the courtesy. When you tap the little number, a box rises like a discreet elevator. The motion is quick, polite, the modern equivalent of sliding one finger down a ribbon and returning to your place without losing your place in thought. In ebooks, footnotes sometimes misbehave and land you 3 chapters away. The digital equivalent of opening the basement door and finding yourself in the garden. No one minds. Getting lost is part of reading. It is merely that the map is now softly illuminated. The human behaviors around notes are their own museum. Some readers never descend. They are happy to let the basement hum. Others read only notes, scavenging for the gossip and the proofs. There are people I envy and fear them who read in two rhythms. Eyes moving like a metronome, sentence, number, note, back again. The motion becomes a cradle. A friend of mine swears that reading footnotes cured her of checking her phone at night. The notes were small enough to finish and numerous enough to satisfy the need to continue. They behaved like raisins in a very dry cake. You never knew where the next one would be, but you knew there would be one soon. Collectors of trivia will want a drawer of footnote curiosities. The longest single note on record in an academic book once meandered over 40 pages, gently like a polite river trying not to disturb villages on either bank. A famous philosopher used a note to apologize for a footnote he had published 20 years earlier. The original error concerned a misdated hat. Another scholar, typing during the age of carbon paper, invented the interleaf note, a sheet folded like a map and glued to the gutter, so that the basement could expand into a small annex. Librarians groaned. Readers smiled the way one smiles when a neighbor's garden creeps under the fence and produces strawberries in your yard. Some of the sweetest uses of footnotes occur where we do not expect them at all. In cookbooks, they carry small reassurances. If your custard appears to fail, it is only thinking. In musical scores, editors hide murmured confidences about which notes are doubtful, which rests are long enough to place the kettle on, how much the bassoon will forgive. In travel guides, the footnote is the friend who tells you the museum is closed on Tuesdays and the bakery sells out by 10. On maps of subways, tiny numbers once led to notes about escalators, dogs, and whether there was a bench near the western entrance where elderly knees could negotiate schedules with the weather. These small acts of care keep the genre humble. A note is not a speech. It is a hand on an elbow down the stairs. Why does the footnote feel sleepy? Because it teaches pacing. The main text strides. The note strolls. The mind learns to live on two levels, which is restful once you trust it. You are allowed to care and not care simultaneously. The sentence tells its story. The note keeps the receipts in case we have questions in the morning. This is immensely comforting. It is the literary equivalent of checking that the door is locked and then remembering that someone already checked, and moreover left a label on the key. The effect is cumulative. By the third chapter of a book that loves its notes, you know that even if you are about to drift off, the facts will continue to attend their overnight duties. Gentle irony hovers here. Footnotes promise that we can separate truth from charm. Yet some of the most charming things in a book live downstairs. The top informs. The bottom confides. The top is proud of the house. The bottom keeps the house running. In that sense, footnotes are domestic history, bills paid, sources cited, roots remembered. They are also mildly comic. A note often begins with a grand flourish for the definitive account of the turnip trade, and ends 3 lines later with a shrug, although the numbers from 1789 remain uncooperative. You can hear the author rubbing his eyes and revising his estimate of turnips. There are, of course, tragedies below the line. A mutilated reference where the page number went missing long ago. A citation to a journal that died in 1903 and has never been resurrected. A note beginning, as everyone knows, and then refusing to elaborate like a friend who forgets the rest of the joke. Yet even these little sorrows are friendly. They remind us that knowledge is a rope made of many thin fibers, some of which fray. A footnote is where we go to witness the fraying and to admire the rope anyway. Allow me a final domestic. Microhook and one 19th century history of railroads. The author used a footnote to record the exact time his teapot whistled while he was writing. 7:42 of the evening, as if the kettle had published a monograph. It contributes nothing to locomotives and everything to the reader's quiet happiness. That is the secret of our small subject. Footnotes are not there to win arguments, although they can. They are there to teach a way of watching a museum of attentions. Even if you never descend, their presence is consoling. They promise that behind every confident paragraph, a small diligent person has checked the map, tied the laces, and left the light on dot, so we end as we began, with a page in low light and a very small staircase. The floorboards creak pleasantly. Above, sentences keep their stride. Below, little lamps wait next to little numbers, patient, uncomplaining, content to be consulted or kindly ignored. You read a line. You float down for the note. You return, unhurried, to the river of text, trusting that somewhere a star and a dagger and an earnest 3 will continue to keep watch long after your eyes have closed, and that in the morning the basement will still be tidy, and the kettle will remember the hour, and the book will be ready to whisper again. You might not expect 5 little words to wander through 2,000 years without changing their shoes, but the Sator Square has that tidy habit, walking from wall to wall as if it owns a tiny passport. If you're still awake by the time we reach the bit where Renaissance monks argue about whether Iripo is a respectable farmer's name or a polite fib, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I'll assume you nodded gently. Like a candle deciding whether to stay lit. The square waits either way. Sator arepo tenet opera rotus. 5 words. 25 letters. A patience that borders on botanical. It grows where it pleases on ash-plastered walls, in tiled floors, on scratched potsherds, in prayer books, in the margins of newspapers used as drawer liners. The trick is not that it is profound. The trick is that it is comfortable. It fits itself like a coaster under the glass of whatever century happens to be sweating, the oldest version we can touch with a careful museum. Finger turned up in Pompeii, where Ash stopped all the sentences mid-breath, and therefore did us the kindness of preserving the punctuation. There, in a house that thought it would still be busy tomorrow, someone etched the square into plaster at a height polite to read. The letters are direct, like a message on a grocery list, and yet the arrangement has stage presence. The 5-word line reads forward and backward. The lines themselves stack into the same word when you reverse the order. The whole thing is a plus sign disguised as text. Nothing in the dig tells us who wrote it. We only know that the room allowed time for inscribing, and that the inscriber believed the room would be visited by eyes that like tidy miracles. Archaeologists copied the square 3 times, once in their notebooks, once in their catalogs, and once in their memories, where it kept working the way a melody keeps working after you close the window. From Pompeii, the square walks north by slow errands, a tile here, a scratched bone there, a wall in Roman Britain that looks as if someone practiced their capitals on the way to lunch. In Gaul, the letters appear with a few of their corners thoughtfully nipped off, like sandwiches cut by a careful ant. Alpine chapels keep it warm. A farmer's house in Austria keeps it warmer. What everyone admires is the way the words behave like obedient furniture. They rotate politely. They read upside down with only a slight adjustment of the head. They never ask for more space than a napkin. Languages have changed around them, but the square smiles the way a shopkeeper smiles in a tourist street, speaking in a phrase everyone recognizes even if nobody can order dinner. Scholars return to the ash again, and again to ask whether the square's origin is occult or practical, and the ash continues to shrug in Latin. The sentence seems plain enough. The sower, Arepo, holds the wheels with effort, or perhaps the sower Arepo guides the wheels with care. There are gentle debates about whether the wheels are of a plow, a mill, or a celestial machine that philosophers prefer to mention when they are confident you will not ask for repairs. The beauty of the line is its respectable ordinariness. If a charm must be repeated to work, better it be a sentence that could plausibly be said by an uncle in a field. Sator sower. Arapel, a name that sounds like it belongs to someone who keeps a pocket knife. Tenet, holds. Opera with effort. Rhoda's wheels. A mildly heroic farmer who does not appear in any epic poem, and therefore feels trustworthy at bedtime. When people encounter a pattern that behaves, they immediately find keys they swear they have misplaced. In the early Middle Ages, clever clergy and lay readers discovered that if you arrange the letters into a cross, you can produce two stacked words, paternoster sharing a central N and crossing like neatly laced boots. Leftover are 4 as and 4 os, which can stand if you invite them for alpha and omega, the first and last. This may be coincidence, or it may be a door someone engineered with a wink. Either way, the square suddenly acquires a devotional basement. In manuscripts where someone has taken the trouble to do the rearranging, the letters look proud of themselves, as if they just returned from a haircut. Not everyone accepts the cross. A few sober scholars from the 18th century, whose wigs had not a single imaginative hair, spotted paternoster and announced that seeing the cross was cheating, like finding pictures in wallpaper. Others loved the wallpaper. They copied the square onto amulets, chalked it above doors, and set it into tiles near thresholds so that the first step of the day would be a little prayer disguised as geometry. Millers liked it because wheels and effort were their livelihood. Farmers liked it because sowers and effort were theirs. In kitchens, the square settled beside recipes as if offering to keep time while the soup considered its future. A tiny microhook from a village ledger, next to a list of lentils. A square appears with a note for the mice, implying the letters were meant to confuse them or at least occupy them long enough for the humans to eat in peace. The square is not only a charm. It is entertainment of a very local, very polite kind. Children learn to trace it like a maze, discovering that no matter which path they take, they arrive where they started. Schoolmasters turn it into a chalk trick on cold days, something to keep hands busy while warm breath makes clouds in the classroom. Mathematically serious people point out that the square is a Latin palindrome at industrial scale, 5 reversible words forming a reversible block, rotational symmetry in a modest suit. Skeptical ants, there is always a skeptical ant wonder aloud whether cleverness is worth much on its own, and then cut another slice of bread. The charm of the thing persists even when nobody looks impressed. It is the persistence that begins to feel like its meaning, uses pile up like folded linens. The square appears on amulets worn against fever. A note in a 17th century medical booklet recommends washing the words into wine and then washing the patient with the wine, a recipe that cures nothing except loneliness. In some towns, the fire brigade etched the square into buckets, as if the letters might tug at outbreaks the way a group of neighbors tugs at a rope. In others, the square was sewn into the lining of traveling coats, a quiet passport that moved more confidently than its owner. Judges, who collect phrases the way some people collect string, liked to keep the square near the desk because it modeled a certain judicial virtue, seeing the case from multiple directions, without changing the facts. The most soothing. Museum label says household use unknown. A Sator square, scratched on the underside of a drawer. In a cottage near the Alps joins this category. Did it protect the hidden love letters? The grain harvest? The last of the winter apples? The ambiguity is its own comfort. At the very least, a person found a sharp object in a quiet minute, the luck of most history, and gave their furniture a private inscription. Over time, technology joined the party. Printers in the Renaissance cut SOTOR squares into wood blocks so they could be stamped quickly. The way you stamp a library card. In a small town almanac, someone ran the square sideways inside a horoscope so that Mars and wheels could rub shoulders just out of sight. Now, and then the words collect an eccentric neighbor. Arepa the plowman writes one playful monk in the margin of a sermon, works with effort, as do we. The rhythm is catechism slow, the kind of joke you enjoy because you know when it will end. A more ambitious commentator suggests that Arepo is not a person at all, but a protective name invented for the square. The way sailors invent names for winds. There's a small pleasure in assigning a biography to a set of letters. In certain French villages, the name Arepo sneaks into parish records as a dog, which feels exactly right, faithful, mild, and always headed toward the field, because the square is so friendly. It attracts revisions like a sweater attracts lint. Antiquarians flip rotas in opera, then build long rationales to explain why they have done so. A schoolbook prints a version with teens because a child miscopied and the teacher was serene. A tile maker reverses an R and says nothing because tiles have a schedule. The square endures these indignities without sighing. In this way, it resembles folk songs and doorknobs. It works whether or not anyone explains it correctly. The force that keeps it moving is not doctrine but appetite. People like to carry small portable order. The words provide that order without requiring belief in anything louder than a plow. The square creates work softly. Antiquarians trace lines of descent as if charting a family whose members keep moving without forwarding addresses. Linguists argue whether the Latin is good or merely fine enough to do errands. One camp insists that Arepo cannot be a proper name because it is nowhere else attested. The other camp says that is exactly what makes it a good proper name, no cousins showing up with claims. Modern puzzle enthusiasts, who love a small problem that refuses to grow large, print the square on t-shirts and coffee mugs, not in triumph, but in solidarity. The letters look back with the equanimity of a tiled floor. Science visits without hurrying. Mathematically inclined friends explain rotational symmetries at tea, drawing tiny arrows on the napkin and returning the napkin to the table precisely as it was. Cryptographers nod at the square as they pass, acknowledging a relative who never went to university but knew how to fold paper to make four corners meet. The paleography lab measures letter shapes and stroke habits to sort instances by century, the way birdwatchers sort finches by songs. Some examples turn out to be surprisingly recent, scratched on barns by people who liked old phrases the way they like old tools useful because they are quiet. Other examples are undeniably ancient and refuse to explain why they landed where they did. The net result is a stout maybe. Hard-headed rationalists propose less romantic origins. Perhaps the square began as a warm-up exercise for stonecutters. Carving letters that look good from both sides makes the hand limber, and a tidy block pleases a client. Perhaps it was used by apprentice scribes to practice not losing their place, a kind of ancient typing drill. These explanations are not enemies of charm. They merely shift it. How soothing to imagine a cold morning, a young hand, a teacher with a wool scarf, and a block of letters that rewards precision with a small miracle. If the square began as practice and later became protection, that is not a fall from grace. That is a workbench learning the word grace. The age of thesis statements tried to pin the square to a meaning as if it were a butterfly that had offended someone. Strong claims were made. The words are a secret Christian acrostic, declared some, because Pater Noster forms a cross and the leftover letters politely spell beginnings and ends. Others pointed out that the square predates the ages in which such cleverness would be expected to survive openly. Another group argued that the phrase is agricultural and therefore practical, which is another way of saying, let's all relax. Meanwhile, the square sat in glass and allowed school children to look wise. When modernity arrived with catalog numbers and climate control, the square looked neither embarrassed nor proud. It simply behaved. Museums label it magical formula or a palindrome charm because well-liked arrangement feels too faint for a brass plaque. Digital archives give the square a high-resolution portrait, which makes its imperfections look distinguished, like an actor's wrinkles. On certain websites, you can click the letters and watch them rotate to recreate the miracle without the ash, though the ash is part of the lullaby. In quiet moments, scholars still publish articles, cool as library tile, establishing that a given square is early 2nd century and therefore an elder relative of the ones in the north. The conclusion is always the same. The family resemblance is strong. The conversation is ongoing. Nobody feels the need to raise their voice. At home, the square continues its domestic errands. People who cannot remember passwords choose the 5 words because they make a friendly phrase, and because typing them produces a small sense of participation in something older than the inbox. Calligraphers use the square as a scale exercise and end up pleasantly astonished at how evenly the letters distribute themselves across a page. Teachers write the square on the board during a sleepy afternoon and watch as a room full of students discover that palindromes are not only race car and level, but also sentences that behave like fields. With furrows and wheels and effort, night is the square's favorite time. It suits bedside tables. The letters share a look with alarm clocks that have learned to be modest. A traveler in a hotel room writes the square on a notepad because the room feels untethered and the square behaves like a temporary anchor. A child copies it before sleep, convinced that the farmer with the wheels is competent, that the field is ordinary, that effort is normal and can be held. This is the square's great gift. Its hero is not an emperor or a general, but someone who studies a tool and keeps going. Even skeptics accept that such a charm cannot harm you. As you let your eyes soften. It is pleasant to imagine the square moving along its quiet route, from a wall that believed in tomorrow to a tile that expected footsteps, from a book margin that enjoyed a pause to a drawer that kept a secret, from a priest's sermon to a miller's pail, from an archivist's box to your pillow. The words do not ask to be solved so much as accompanied. Sator arepo tenet opera rotus. The farmer arepo holds the wheels with effort. You may choose the translation you like best. Tens, guides, studies, keeps. They all amount to the same bedtime moral. Someone is working carefully. The wheels are turning quietly. The square fits wherever it is placed and waits with a patience that neither boasts nor begs. If you return to the beginning and read it backward, the sentence is still the same, which is a kind of promise. You can drift, you can wake, you can drift again, and the work will carry on at a pace that neither hurries nor lingers. The letters are arranged as if they were built to be remembered by a tired mind, unspooling and respooling without catching. And if somewhere far away and long ago, a wall in Pompeii still holds its breath, the square is there too, repeating itself like a sturdy lullaby that does not mind repeating. It never insists. It only holds. The farmer keeps the wheels. The wheels keep the time. The time keeps the room. And the room, polite as ever, lets the lights dim to ash and the sentence continue without needing you to finish it.